said, hello, welcome. So glad you guys are here. We know people are joining from not only all over the country, but all over the world. I'm Meredith O'Neill. If you don't know me, I am the CEO of the John Ritter Foundation for Aortic Health. So glad to have you here and incredibly honored to have these incredible researchers joining us today. Really excited for you to hear what they have to say. Research is the cornerstone of the JRF mission. And uh, it has been since the beginning. Since the John Ritter Foundation was founded, we have been giving money to research. Over the past couple of years, strategically, we have been diversifying our research dollars. And now we are really excited that strategically we are giving money to more prevention. So, how can we stop dissections before they happen? How can we improve the quality of life? And just really excited to show you guys where our dollars are going with some of these brilliant people that are on the call today. Research is personally extremely important to me. Just a couple of years ago, I'm the fifth dissection in 4 generations for my family. We had inconclusive DNA tests for many, many years. And just 2 years ago, the mutation that was causing aortic dissection in my family was found through the John Ritter Research Program, and we we're able to test my families and have some answers. So we know we're some of the lucky ones. I know a lot of you are sitting in that unknown. And so I hope you look at our resources, not only on genetic testing, but what to do if you come back with an inconclusive test, because I was there for many years. But that's why we continue to fund research. I wanted to give you some stats that Ellen actually put out earlier today, but I wanted to make sure that I just brought this home as to why we continue to fund research projects and why it's incredibly important. Aortic dissection consistently ranks among the top 20 causes of death, but it continues to be underrecognized and certainly underfunded. In the current climate, there is funding cuts. We got so many more grant proposals this year than we had any other year of our existence. And Ellen might touch on that later, but we're talking exponentially more requests for funding this year. And so the need is great. The need is incredibly great. So we're grateful that you're here, not only for the information, but that you continue to fund our incredibly important mission, because hospitalizations from aortic dissection are rising. And so we need to be able to prevent these. And right now, there is no cure, there is no drug. So there's a lot of work that can be done in this field. And so much has been done in the past 20 to 30 years. Imagine what we can do in the next 20 to 30 years. So with that, I will pass it back to Ellen. Just again, so glad to have you here. And I'm really excited to hear about this.
Yes, thanks so much, Meredith. My name is Ellen Hosteller, and I'm the Chief Science Officer for the John Ritter Foundation. I see so many familiar names in the chat, so thank you all for being here again. And I'm going to move really quickly because I know that I am not the main event here, and we want to hear from our wonderful researchers, and less so for me. So I'm just going to add that this is being recorded, and it will be available usually within 24 hours on our YouTube channel. You'll get a link to it as well if you've registered, so that you can watch again or share it with someone that might be interested as well. And then the last thing I'll add is that there is a Q&A box, so feel free to write in there. Bella Marin, who's our patient advocacy coordinator, is also here talking to folks in the chat. So if you have a question for her, you need resources, help navigating your own care, looking for support, please feel free to reach out to her. I'm sure she'll put her contact info in there as well. And to that end, today we don't have time to answer any individual questions about your own personal care, but we are happy to help. So please contact us, and we can help one-on-one outside of this webinar. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and get started. The first group that we're going to talk to today are some wonderful folks from Geisinger, and they're the three of them, and we're going to hear from their presentation. And I also wanted to add that our second group is from UT Health, and those are also some familiar faces for all of you, but we'll hear from them after the first group. So first we have Dr. Evan Ryer, who's an associate professor of vascular surgery, Dr. Scott Lemaire, who's a professor of cardiothoracic surgery, and Dr. Taraj Mirshahi, who is a professor in the Department of Genomic Health. So I will hand it over to you all, and you should be able to share your screen.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us, and thank you, Ellen. Let me see if I can share my screen now. Ellen said, my name is Taraj Mirjai. I'm a professor in the Department of Genomic Health at Geisinger. I'm the principal investigator of the John Ritter Foundation funded project to improve early detection of thoracic aortic dissections. I want to start by expressing my sincere appreciation to the John Ritter Foundation for their support of our work and for their leadership on aortic health. For those of you who are not familiar with Geisinger, we are a large healthcare system that serves central and northeast Pennsylvania. And again, as Ellen mentioned, I'm joined by two of my colleagues, Dr. Scott Lemaire, who's a cardiothoracic surgeon and our Chief Associate Scientific Officer. Scott will begin the talk by walking us through what aortic dissections are, their risks, and why our current approaches to detecting them is not serving patients as they could. Then Dr. Evan Ryer, who's a vascular surgeon and the vice chair of vascular surgery at Geisinger, will explain why Geisinger is such a ideal place to tackle this challenge. He'll describe the tremendous amount of clinical and genetic data we have within our integrated health system and how that positions us to rethink how we identify people at risk of dissections. And then finally, I'll come back and talk about how we believe we can actually make this shift and how modern data science and machine learning can help us move from reacting to dissections to predicting them before they happen. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to Scott.
Yeah, thank you for that, Taraj. And I want to echo Taraj's thanks to the John Ritter Foundation for Aortic Health for their support of our work. And I thought in case there were some on the call who weren't as familiar with the condition of aortic dissection, we just start with some basic considerations about this disease. So aortic dissection, this diagram on the left shows the normal aorta in its relationship to the heart. And the blow up shows what happens when there's an aortic dissection. There's a tear in the wall of the blood vessel that then allows blood to enter into those layers and actually tear the aorta apart. And this is an example of a dissection that has occurred in the first part of the aorta. We call the ascending aorta, which is right next to the heart. And this is commonly referred to as type A dissection. Now, type A dissection of all the dissections represents about 2/3. We'll talk about the other type B, in a moment. The average age for patients coming in with a sudden dissection of their ascending aorta is 62 years, and about twice as many males are affected compared to females. This is an illustration of what we call type B dissection, where the dissection actually begins and extends down the back part of the aorta, which we call the descending thoracic aorta, past where the branches from the aorta arise, those branches going to the arms and to the head. And the shown on the right is sort of what the inside of the aorta looks like after a dissection, where you can see what should be one large channel delivering blood to all of the organs in the body. You end up with two channels. One is called the false lumen, which has a torn outer aortic wall that's extremely fragile and can dilate rapidly and cause rupture, which is often fatal. So type B dissections are about 1/3 of dissections. Average age is about the same as type A, early 60s. And again, about twice as many males are affected as compared to females. Now, the risk factors for aortic dissection are many. Many of them relate to common cardiovascular risk factors, as you would think of for coronary disease, a stroke, and others. Advanced age, males are more likely to have aortic dissection. And then things like hypertension, smoking, and atherosclerosis. As you all are aware, there are genetic conditions that can lead to aortic dissection at much younger ages than what we see in patients without these genetic variants. Patients who have anomalies of their heart are also at increased risk, and the most common of these is called bicuspid aortic valve. And then finally listed here is aortic aneurysm. So aneurysm is distinct from dissection in that it's when the wall of the aorta weakens and the vessel dilates, and becomes larger or ballooned compared to normal, but without a tear in the wall. But as the wall dilates, it becomes weaker and can be a trigger for aortic dissection. And you'll see why that's critically important for the work that we're proposing. This is meant to show how lethal aortic dissection is, and this is a study, a very large study, largest group of aortic dissection patients ever assembled. It's called IRAD, the International Registry of Acute Aortic Dissection, and this looks at 20 years of data from that. And you can see on the bottom is the time between when somebody develops dissection and goes out to about 2 months, 60 days, and then on the y-axis is the survival. And so every time the line drops, that's a reduction in survival. And you can see in the blue line, the type A dissections are those that have the worst survival. And with treatment, so these are patients that arrive in the hospital, receive initial medical management and then surgical repair. Still, more than 30% of those patients go on to die of the condition within the first 2 months. Type B dissection is somewhat less lethal in that 15% of patients, again, with treatment, don't survive even 2 months. Now, what's not shown here is the many patients who never make it to the hospital because it can cause sudden death. And autopsy studies have shown that a large number of patients with aortic dissection simply never make it to the hospital. So this, to some degree, underestimates how lethal these conditions are. Now, importantly, there are no medications that are reliable in preventing aortic dissection. Some patients get blood pressure control and a variety of other things to try to reduce the risk, but they're not particularly effective. And ultimately, surgery is the only way in someone with a diseased aorta to actually prevent dissection. And you want to have that surgery done when it's not an emergency. So we call elective surgical aortic repair. The challenge is deciding when somebody should have an operation and who should have an operation. How much has their aorta dilated or grown before an elective operation should be done in order to predict dissection? And we tend to rely on aortic diameter a lot when making decisions about when to repair the aorta. And so the guidelines suggest that 5.5 centimeters of diameter is the time when it's recommended to have a patient undergo elective repair. But as you'll see here, that's not a perfect guideline. Shown on the left are the number of aortic dissections involving the ascending aorta, so that's type A dissection, that occur either above, shown in blue, or below that 5.5 centimeters. And what you can see is nearly 70% of patients that have a type A dissection had diameters that were lower than what we routinely recommend in terms of a guideline for having elective repair. And on the right, you can see we also don't do well in predicting from diameter when somebody's going to have a type B dissection, with 81% of patients with dissection of their descending aorta occurring at diameters that are below that 5.5 centimeters. So although we have reasonable guidelines for those with large aortas, what we really struggle with is identifying which patients with the smaller aortas should undergo these operations, which, although have relatively low risks of major complications, they're still large operations with risks. And so we have to carefully balance when to operate and when not to operate. And so with that, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Evan Ryer, to discuss the need for change and the rationale for the study we're proposing. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. It's obvious that we need to talk about and rethink how we identify those at risk for aortic dissection. Like Scott highlighted, we focused on the size of the aorta, with the general premise that when the aorta gets big enough, it becomes dangerous. But as the graphs you saw, that's not the only predictor, and the risk of dissection is influenced by many different factors. For example, your genetics play a role, right? The way you were born, your DNA can make your aorta more fragile. Your age, your body size, your blood pressure all change the amount of stress on the aorta. even inflammation or the shape or the curvature of your aorta matter. And we can see all those details on monitored imaging. Because so many elements contribute to the risk, relying on just its size, it's not enough. It's like trying to predict the weather using only the temperature. When you do that, you're gonna get a lot wrong. So instead of a one-size-fits-all approach, we are trying to develop a personalized, data-driven model that looks at the whole picture. You know, and that's what we're trying to build, a way to identify high-risk individuals earlier, more accurately, and long before an emergency occurs. We have the next slide, Scott. So why are we doing this work at Geisinger, and why can we do it in a way that most places can't? Well, it comes down to the structure of our entire system. We are a large health system, 9 hospitals, 250 clinic sites, over 3,000 providers, a medical school, and our own insurance company. We care for over 3 million people here in central and northeast Pennsylvania. In addition to that, we have one of the world's largest biobank, with up to over 350,000 individuals enrolled that have full genome sequencing. Because so many of our patients receive all their care, both primary care and surgical specialty care within our health system, we can connect their medical history, their imaging study, and their genetic information in one unified system. And this creates a powerful long-term view of each patient's health. Very few health systems in the country have this level of integration and allows us to see patterns that others can't. Patterns that may reveal who is at risk long before an aortic dissection occurs. Next slide, Scott. To really understand who is at risk, we have to look at more than one type of information. We propose and we plan on combining 3 major sources of information. One is from the electronic medical record, so things like blood pressure, medication, family history, labs, and others. Imaging, basically what the aorta looks like on CAT scan. And genetics, insights from our biobank, or what we call our MyCode program. When we layer these pieces together, we start to see a much clearer picture. And we hope that this is switching from a blurry lens to something with a little bit more high definition. By using this combined information, we hope to create a prediction tool that is far more accurate than anything based on a single measurement. Next slide, Scott. When we examine the aorta on CAT scan, we're not just measuring how wide it is. As a matter of fact, we believe that important warning signs can appear long before the size becomes dangerous. For example, we can measure inflammation around the aorta, which leads to weakening of the aortic wall, calcium buildup, which makes the aorta stiffer and less resilient, and tortuosity, so how curved or twisted the aorta were. This increased bending relates to increased physical stress, and we believe puts patients at risk for aortic dissection. These features show up on routine CAT scans that people get every day within our health system, and we are trying to use them in smarter ways to better understand the patient's future aortic risk. Next slide, please. One of the most valuable advantages we have here at Geisinger is because we see these people over such long periods of time, is that we have CAT scans taken before some of these patients experiencing aortic dissection. This gives us a unique window into early changes that most clinicians never get a chance to see. Instead of guessing what the aorta looked like before the emergency, we plan to measure it directly and look for clues. And to be honest with you, we think that this is a game changer. It allows us to identify subtle changes months or even years before a dissection occurs. And these early clues are exactly what we need to build tools that can predict risk early enough to truly prevent these life-threatening events. Next slide. As everybody on this call knows, genetics plays a much bigger role in aortic diseases, but that is not apparent to everybody. We do realize there are rare but powerful conditions like Marfan syndrome, Lewy-Dietz, or vascular Ehlers-Danlos that greatly increase the chance of aortic dissection. And for these people afflicted with these syndromes, close monitoring is absolutely essential. But here's the key point. Most dissections don't come from a single obvious gene mutation. And that's where polygenic risk scores come in. These risk scores look at thousands of small markers across the DNA and combine them into one score. I like to think of this as adding up hundreds of little votes. Some raise your risk slightly, while others lower it. But the total tells us much more about your genetic risk than a single mutation. When we combine polygenic risk scores with traditional factors, like we talked about, blood pressure, age, imaging, we can uncover hidden layers of risk that we would otherwise miss. And we hope our research will lead to two very important insights. Some people who look low risk on CAT scan may actually have a higher genetic risk and mean closer monitoring, and others who are told that they were high risk may not need to worry as much. Our goal is not to alarm people, but it's to personalize risk assessment. And if someone does determine to be high risk, we can follow them more closely and intervene earlier. If their genetic risk is low, well, we hope to give them real peace of mind. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Taraj.
Thank you. So as Evan described, we have this unique combination of electronic health records, including lab values, diagnoses, etc., medications, as well as genetics and the imaging data that he mentioned from the CAT scans. So the question is, how do we take these combination of data and make better sense and make a better predictor of this disease? So what I'm going to talk about from this point on is the proposed project, again, made possible by the support of the Ritter Foundation, which aims to answer exactly that question. So the goal is ambitious, but very straightforward. The idea is to use the data that's already in the patient's chart to estimate their personal risk of developing a thoracic aortic dissection. So we can do this for everyone who has these data in his records, right? We not only for patients who show up to cardiothoracic surgery or vascular surgery. We can kind of develop this as a base for everyone. And the idea is to do this not after a symptom, not after an emergency, but beforehand. So how do we do this? For this, we rely heavily on AI. And people hear the word AI and it sounds really mysterious. And they're like, okay, what does AI do? AI is very simple. What AI can actually do is it can look at patterns in data and see things that we cannot see with the naked eye, right? So the first step of the AI that we have used for this is what Evan alluded to, which is the deep learning that we use to segment the aortas from the CTs automatically. So when patients come to a health system like ours, they get CTs for all kinds of reasons. We get chest CTs. Probably most of the people who come in, they get chest CTs because of lung issues. But that CT also, that CAT scan also captures their thoracic aorta. And what we have done is that we have taken those CTs and we have actually measured and segmented the aorta out. And we have measured the diameter of the aorta from each one of them. And we have measured the factors like Evan was talking about, tortuosity. We have looked at periaortic fat and we are looking at calcification inside those aorta. So those becomes new factors that we can actually add to a prediction model. So that's the first step where we have already used the AI to kind of advance this. The second one is to look at patterns in data that are too complex within the electronic health records. And for these, what we use is machine learning. And within machine learning, we look at things that are a combination of things that are interacting, not one at a time, but hundreds and thousands at a time. And one of the approaches that we use for this is called gradient boosting. And it gets a bit complicated, but I'm going to kind of try to simplify it a little bit. Gradient boosting is essentially like having hundreds and hundreds of experts who are looking at the same data set, and they have a decision tree of putting these data and in different buckets of risk, let's say, right? And then when you combine these thousands of these kind of little experts, what happens is that you get a very nice risk, recognition of risk patterns that you could not see with one or two experts. That's kind of how you can think about these decision trees that we're doing with these gradient boosting models. So by using these two approaches, the first one gives us the imaging data. We have the electronic health record data, as Evan mentioned, and then we have the genetic data that we have collected from our mycote population. We combine all of these, and we're hoping to train a model on all of them to kind of improve our risk prediction. So can we go to the next slide, please, Scott? So one of the important things about AI that you hear more and more, especially in healthcare, is trust and transparency. So accuracy is not enough, right? For cases like dissections, the telling somebody that you're at risk for a dissection can be a heavy conversation. So you really need to be able to explain to them why you're telling them what you're telling them. So the approaches that we're using, the AI approaches that we're using, are meant to mitigate that kind of lack of transparency, if you may. And for this, we lean on something called SHAP values. And as you can see here, I'm showing an example for an abdominal aortic aneurysm that we have done a lot of work around. Our dissection project is obviously just getting started, and so we don't have this data for that, and we're working on it. But I'm going to go over a very similar pattern of what we have done for AAA, and this very same paradigm will apply to dissections, which we hope to have by the end of the funding period that we have from the Ritter Foundation. So what you see on top is what we call a SHAP plot. And what you're looking at these red and blue dots. And what these are showing is they're showing what the factors that increase or reduce the risk for aneurysms in this case. And what you can see is that things like age, sex, being male, or smoking history, being a smoker, or having a larger body surface area, all of those, as you can see, all the red dots are on the right, which means that they increase your risk of having an aneurysm, and not having those show a reduced risk. So, which is what you see on the left with the blue dots, and those are what we call kind of bee swarm plots that you can see. So when you combine these kind of things, what you can do is that you can kind of get an individualized risk for every patient that comes in. Now, not every patient is going to have every risk factor, but the way these machine learning models are built is that they can actually weigh those risk factors and then come up with a final weight for a given individual. And this is where it's going to be very useful and helpful in clinic when a provider is speaking to a patient saying that, Mr. Smith, this is why you're at high risk. And that comes into this whole idea of trust and transparency that we're talking about. And if you go to the next slide, I'm showing a couple of examples for our AAA predictor. What you see on top is, on the right, what you see is what we call a waterfall plot. And this is for an 86-year-old male who was a smoker. And what happens is that everybody, the entire population, in this case for a risk of having an aneurysm, starts at a specific risk, which is what you see here, which says minus 4.49. So that's the average risk for the entire population. Now, if you're to the right of that, you're more likely to have a AAA. If you're the further you are to the left, you're less likely to have AAA. And what we can see for AAA, we know things like age, being male, and smoker kind of push your risk to the right. That's where you see those right red arrows that add numbers as they go to the right. And then there's things that reduce your risk. Having a higher HDL, for instance, in this patient reduces this risk. So when you add up all of these risks that this patient has, you come up with a final number. What you see on the top right, that FX equals 0.308. So that is the individual risk for this patient based on their very specific data that we got from their clinical data that we have collected. And that essentially says that this person is at a high risk of having AAA. And lo and behold, this person did have AAA. And if we go next slide, now the bottom one is a very similar data set from an 85-year-old female non-smoker. So very similar age. Again, the starting risk is about the same. But for this patient, when we add all the risk factors that they have, their age obviously pushes them to the right, but having not smoked pushes them to the left. Being female pushes it to the left. And what you see is that for this patient, the risk of having an aneurysm is much lower than the patient that we discussed, in the panel above. And again, you can see not every factor is present in both of the patients, but they all came from the same gradient boosted mechanism where we identified the important factors that put you at a higher risk of AAA. And as a physician, what you can do is that you can take this type of an approach and based on this very transparently and clearly communicate to your patient, yes, this is why you're at a high risk, or no, this is why your risk is low. And then the idea is that if you go to the next slide, we can use this type of data. And based on the risk that we identified for a given patient, we can, number one, detect the risk before dissections happen. So as you saw, this is based on historic data that the patients have in their electronic health records. And if they're at low risk, if they're at no risk, obviously that's great. If they're at low risk, you essentially do routine monitoring, you maintain, optimal blood pressure, and you promote prevention. If they're at medium risk, then you do a closer follow-up, tighter blood pressure control, and lifestyle management. And then if they're higher risk, you decide if there is a need for surgical evaluation or screening of first degree relatives, further genetic testing, all the more advanced type of care that we can provide. But what's critical here is we can apply this to the entirety of the population. If a patient has an electronic health record, they have some imaging data, and they have some genetic data, we can take the combination of those and create this personalized risk score, if you may. And quite frankly, if somebody doesn't have the imaging or genetic data, we can still create this risk score, but it may not be as accurate, but it might be good enough as a first step. So the idea is that if you go to the next slide, what you can do is that you can this is a kind of a mock-up of what we would love to be able to do, in the future, is to kind of have this screen pop up when a physician opens a patient's chart on their electronic health record, whether it's Epic or whatever they use, is where you see all the risks at the bottom. What are the clinical contributing factors? What are the imaging contributing factors? What are genetic contributing factors to a diagnosis of dissection, let's say? And then that person is flagged as being at high risk, and then the physician can recommend very specific, regimens for them to follow, or refer them to, vascular surgery or cardiothoracic surgery or cardiology as they need it. So this is the idea that we hope to achieve. I'm hoping to be most of the way there by the end of the funding period for this grant that we have from the Ritter Foundation, and then hopefully we can implement this and add it to electronic health records and kind of in our system. So the idea is then we hopefully can expand this across different institutions and populations. People more and more have, wearables where you kind of get your, heart rate, you get blood pressures on your Apple Watches these days, and we can get more and more lab biomarkers. And one of the great things about AI is that it can handle massive amounts of data. We can have, tens of thousands of different types of data, and we can add it to this model, and they usually improve our models. And then hopefully we can kind of use these data and partner with the JRF and others to improve awareness and proactive screening. So the next slide, I just have the a future vision that we have for the future is where the risk can be measured early, that can be communicated clearly and acted on proactively. So predict, personalize, and prevent. So at the end, I would like to next slide. I would like to acknowledge the participants in the MyCode program at Geisinger, where we get our genetic data, as well as all our patients whose records went into the models that we have developed. The John Ritter Foundation for funding us. We are grateful for this funding opportunity. I know it was very competitive, and we're again very happy that we were awarded one, and we are hoping that we can kind of provide the kind of results that the foundation is hoping for, as well as a couple of people in my group and groups in vascular surgery that helped put some of this together. And then if you go to the next slide, Yeah, let's talk about how we can predict and prevent the next aortic dissection. And please reach out with questions, comments, and we're available for those. And again, I want to thank the foundation for giving us the opportunity to present our ideas and for their generous funding of our project.
Thank you all so much. I can say that we love that vision and share it as well. And the mock dashboard that you showed, wow, would that be incredible? That would be a big game changer. So we're going to move directly on to the next presentation now, but there is time for questions at the end. So again, please feel free to put those in the Q&A if you would like. And now I will pass it to our second group, which is Dr. Siddharth Prakash, who is a cardiologist and geneticist professor at the UT Health Houston, and Dr. David Murdoch, who is a assistant professor of genetics at UT Health Houston as well. So I will let you guys take the floor.
Thanks, Ellen, and good evening, everyone. Thank you for tuning in. I will start, and while I'm getting up my slides, in the chat, can everyone who has participated in research on aortic disease, can you indicate? It would be great to see how many research participants we have, because research drives what we do, and we're very grateful to everyone who contributed. All right. So I'm going to talk about our project, which is Aorta GPT. And this is an AI-powered decision support app for heritable thoracic aortic disease. As I discussed, research over the last 3 decades has led to the discovery of numerous genes that, when inherited in families, increase the risk for thoracic aortic aneurysms and dissections. These are usually inherited or passed down in what we call a dominant manner, meaning that only one copy of the gene needs to be affected in order for people to develop the disease. And with these conditions, we have developed an entire set of guidelines, largely through JRF funding, through their research program, efforts at our institution and others to discover new inherited forms of genetic disease. So again, making an impact. The problem has been translating these findings into the clinic. In a recent study, it was shown that most cardiologists in the United States are not comfortable talking about genetic test results with their patients. In fact, fewer than 1/3 felt that they were able to accurately interpret the results of a cardiovascular genetic test. And that includes the kinds of tests that people get for aneurysms and dissections. This is a real problem because the number of people getting genetic testing is only increasing. And we need a workforce that has this ability to interpret these findings. So what do? We give them a pocket tool that can help them. So this is my disclaimer. And in addition to that, I can say that I have no personal conflicts with this research that we're going to share. I'm going to talk a little bit about the reason why we need an app like this, some of which I went over, the goals for our app, the conceptual framework on which it's built, and then future directions. As you know, thoracic aortic aneurysms, if anything, appear to be increasing in the population. Most of these cases that we see in families, we think are caused by single gene mutations and can be inherited. And we know that knowing the genetic cause can prevent deaths because we can identify patients by screening them for the genetic variant and/or detecting them earlier than they would otherwise be detected. We also know that genes that cause syndromic forms of TAD, like Marfan syndrome caused by FBN1 variants, do influence decisions about the timing of elective surgery. So the plot that I'm showing here is from the 2022 aortic disease guidelines, which were largely based on work by researchers that I described who discovered individual genetic variants. And you can see that based on the type of gene variant, the size of the aorta when surgery is recommended changes. And many other factors related to aortic care also change. Genetics is difficult to translate into clinical practice because there are relatively few trained clinical geneticists and many more non-geneticists who are likely to need this information. to take care of their patients. And so this kind of app support can not only produce better clinical results, but it can also be an important source of education and awareness in the clinical community about how to manage heritable thoracic aortic disease. So this is an example of reasons why you might need this information. If you have a specific variant in a gene that causes heritable thoracic aortic disease, like ACTA2, it can influence the type of aneurysms that you get, the location in the body, and other clinical features outside the aorta. This can lead to specific recommendations for screening tests and treatments that you would not otherwise select if you did not know the genetic cause. So all of these things are extremely important for people to know, and yet are very opaque if you don't have a lot of genetic background. And it also determines the prognosis of individuals, enabling you to identify high-risk genetic variants that predict worse outcomes and need more immediate and prompt targeted treatment. So the challenge around this is interpreting the patient's genetic variant if they've had genetic testing, linking the genetic test results to prognosis, and then creating actionable recommendations. And what we know is that these results need to be continuously updated because, as many people may realize, genetic testing is improving over time, and we are understanding more genes and more variants every year that cause heritable thoracic aortic disease. And therefore, the actionable recommendations also need to be changed and personalized based on an individual's estimated risk. This is the role that we anticipate for Aorta GPT. So our app, Aorta GPT, will serve as a clinical support and decision support and learning platform because it will enable personalized risk estimates and also an accurate guideline-based reasoning that help clinicians to interpret genetic data confidently at the point of care. It will also aid in educating patients because a patient-facing version could explain the person's genetic test result in plain language and answer common questions that are very difficult to access for patients through their medical record or through questions to their doctor, and also personalize lifestyle and follow-up recommendations based on their genetic risk. In addition, it can be an interactive learning platform for students to really train the next generation of aortic providers, and then in that trainees can explore realistic patient cases that are simulated with the gene and variant to understand how prognosis changes according to the gene and be able to design interventions that more accurately handle the risk that the gene predicts. And finally, it can help to introduce AI and translational genetic medicine at the point of care into clinical practice by making people feel more comfortable and familiar with key genetic data and model an evidence-based framework that could be replicated across many types of rare diseases, not just heritable thoracic aortic disease, creating an enduring learning platform. The key properties of this Aorta GPT app are it draws data from trusted clinical sources that we curate from the guidelines, and these will be updated every 6 months by a review of the literature. And it uses a specific type of technology to restrain or constrain responses to curated variables. It reads in and organizes the responses so that they can be expressed in rapidly at the point of care. It intelligently searches through the data to retrieve the closest match to the patient who is being examined, and it will generate precision recommendations based on the individual characteristics of the patient. Second, Aorta GPT is curated to develop automated genetic data updates. One of the challenges of previous approaches like this were that genetic data changes so rapidly that it's almost impossible for manual curation methods to keep up. Even experts like the ClinGen Consortium struggle to keep up with the volume of genetic data that changes on a daily basis. By automating this process, Aorta GPT will be continuously updated with new variants that cause heritable thoracic aortic disease as soon as they are published. And it does this using an electronic connection to worldwide databases of genetic variants that are updated each time a new variant is discovered and published. Finally, Aorta GPT will have a machine learning-based risk model that develops an informed prediction of patient risk based upon their genetic and clinical variants, and can be changed interactively based on information that the patients enter at the point, and clinicians at the point of care. And it also draws directly from patient registries, including the Montalcino Aortic Consortium Registry, to estimate gene-based risk based on real patient data. And in maintaining this active link to snapshots of clinical registry data, it will continuously update risk and improve over time as additional patients enroll in research and their genetic information is captured. This will create an improving learning model with more data and a more accurate machine learning risk calculation as data accrues. In addition, it will allow you to add in data about clinical risk factors and family history to modify the genetic risk and see in real time how this changes the potential outcomes and the need for interventions. And the machine learning model will become better at making these predictions over time with feedback and more data. So the overall goal looks like this. We have on the left a set of data that could be genetic, a facial recognition, which my colleague David Murdoch is going to talk about shortly, the aortic data that you might have heard about, and risk modifiers that we discussed in the previous talk. These would be fed into a trained risk model to recalibrate risk, adjust guidance, and create an output based on a risk prediction engine that allows you to adjust a personalized risk-based assessment and then drive clinical recommendations based upon that assessment. What makes this different from a regular chatbot is that it will use peer-reviewed evidence from verified sources. It uses special reasoning to pull specific gene and variant information that is updated at the point of care. It pulls in real-time clinical and genetic data, and it provides traceable evidence so that every recommendation can be verified. Finally, it will output a graph to estimate risk using a machine learning risk model that is personalized for the patient, allowing them to see how changing risk factors can change the survival curve. And in the future, our current goals for the development of this app by May of 2026 will be an enhanced user interface that allows people to interact with the app with more free text language, an expanded machine learning risk model that pulls in additional data, and we're also going to perform extensive validation and clinical testing using pilot studies against real-world clinical decision makers. I'd like to acknowledge the group at the UT Health Houston who has worked on this app, including Krishi Manam, Ernesto Martinez, and my colleague Diana Milowitz, Rice University, Muskan Tayal, and then other groups in our Williams School of Biomedical Informatics, Divakar Rogath, Hongfeng Liu, and her colleagues. In addition, I want to specifically cite help from the Montalcino Aortic Consortium on which this data is largely based. Thank you.
So yes, thank you so much for the opportunity to talk about this component of Aorta GPT, which is using AI-powered facial recognition. And so I'd just like to, again, thank the JRF as well as mention the Montalcino Aortic Consortium, or MAC, that have also supported us for this work. So I'll just start by showing a map here to really reinforce kind of why we're doing what we're doing, which is the overall general lack of clinical geneticists in the US as well as globally. So this is a picture from a recent paper that illustrates kind of where the clinical geneticists are located in the US. And as is pretty evident, you can see that they're mostly focused in kind of the large cities. So that leaves, huge areas of the country, in some cases, entire states without any clinical geneticists. And so these are the people that, are going to be evaluating, assessing these individuals for the various HTAD conditions like Marfan, Loeys-Dietz, vascular EDS. So, you can clearly see that there's a great shortage. And we know that with these conditions, it's really imperative to identify them as early as possible so that they can be managed appropriately and have better outcomes. So we developed this kind of component of Aorta GPT as a tool to help kind of your general practitioner screen these individuals without the need for formal clinical geneticist evaluation. And for that, we're really leveraging some of the unique facial features that many of these conditions have. And so I'll talk a little bit more about what that is by just kind of showing you some pictures. So these are not real patients, but these are kind of typical faces from someone with Marfan syndrome on the left and someone with vascular Ehlers-Danlos on the right. So with Marfan syndrome, these individuals tend to have kind of long, narrow faces, unique shapes and kind of angles of the eyes, a small recessed jaw. Whereas someone with vascular EDS or VEDS, they tend to have kind of large eyes, a small, narrow nose, thin lips, but it can be quite subtle. And so during clinical genetics training, we are taught to recognize some of these characteristic facial features, and that helps us to determine kind of who needs to be tested, what kind of testing to send, as well as the kind of likelihood of the test coming back positive. But given the overall lack of clinical geneticists, we wanted to develop a tool, an AI-based tool that could do this same kind of facial analysis, but that any medical provider could use. And so the basic idea is, again, to use AI or artificial intelligence to recognize these characteristic facial features. So there are a lot of existing tools out there that can extract facial features from pictures. I mean, you all have probably noticed when you take out your phone, you're taking a picture of someone or others, the phone can very quickly tag who is who in the picture. Or even now at airports, many of them are using just facial images to replace, the need for a driver's license to prove who you are. So the technology is there, but what we have done is really kind of leverage that for this particular use case. So with that, we can extract facial features from an image, and then use an AI trained model that has been trained on the images of individuals with these various HTAC conditions. So Marfan syndrome, the various Loeys-Dietz syndromes, vascular EDS. And then the model can then give you an overall likelihood of an underlying diagnosis of one of these conditions. In this case, the highest for Marfan syndrome. So that's the basic idea. And this is a paper that we published just this year, which is kind of a proof of principle a study where we showed that this approach works very well for vascular Ehlers-Danlos or VEDS. Where using this kind of technology, we can very accurately distinguish between someone who has VEDS and someone who doesn't. And so we're able to distinguish VEDS from the general population, as well as VEDS from another condition called hypermobile EDS, which it's very important to distinguish those two. And then we also showed that when we ask the AI tool to tell us what features it's using to distinguish cases from controls, we find that it's exactly the same things that we're taught as clinical geneticists. So the eyes, the nose, and the lips, and that's kind of what those images at the bottom in deep blue. Those are what the AI is really using to distinguish people who have VEDS from people who don't. So it works extremely well, and in many ways, it works even better than a human who's been trained on these. So, this would be an ideal kind of use for areas that just don't have access to genetic evaluation or even genetic testing at all. And more recently, we found that this kind of approach works very well for Marfan syndrome, where we get very high accuracy in distinguishing people who have Marfan and those who don't. And that this technique also works well for Loeys-Dietz syndrome. And here I'm showing you the results from looking at Loeys-Dietz syndrome type 4. So we know that it works, and this kind of more proof of principle works quite well. But we wanted to take it to the next step to actually develop and implement a tool that a medical provider could use. And so that's where over the next year we're going to be working with the help of the JRF to actually develop an app for this very purpose. So the basic idea is to, again, train these HTAD specific facial models. So for Marfan syndrome, for the different Loeys-Dietz subtypes, vascular Ehlers-Danlos, and then implement this into a mobile app so that any kind of medical provider, a physician, a nurse can just download this app and then use it to screen these individuals that they're seeing. And really, ultimately, the goal is to screen, to make an early diagnosis so that you can start the guideline-based management as early as possible. Because we know that doing so improves outcomes, it improves lives, it reduces the complications. But the key is to identify these individuals as early as possible so that they can benefit from all of that. So, what are some of the use cases for this kind of app? Well, there are many, but these are just a few of the most obvious ones. The first is a child coming into a pediatrician's office. Let's say, normally, just like, the doctor listens with a stethoscope, listening for murmurs. This could be part of a standard evaluation. So the nurse or physician could just take a picture of the child and then get a sense of the likelihood of an underlying HTAD diagnosis. And if it's high, they can send them for testing, and should it be positive, they can go ahead and be imaged, have echo, CT, started on medications to slow the progression of any aortic aneurysms. Or let's say, teenagers in high school, they're going to start playing real competitive sports, football, hockey, soccer, whatever sport. A lot of places they're doing sports physicals. This again could be, a very easy tool to incorporate in that, where the physician or nurse again could take a picture of the teenager and then get an idea of the underlying likelihood of an HTAD condition, and then send them for echo if appropriate. Or let's say even in an emergent situation, a young person comes into the emergency room with chest pain. Normally the first thing you think about is heart attack. But this could again become part of a chest pain, diagnostic set, where they just take out the app, take a picture of the patient, and get an idea of the likelihood of an underlying diagnosis. So let's say it comes back high likelihood for Marfan syndrome. They could go ahead, order a CT scan and make a diagnosis of an aortic dissection. Or even if that's already been diagnosed, this could be helpful in kind of determining what kind of management would be optimal for those individuals. So, a lot of use cases, and this would be especially beneficial for areas, as I said, that lack clinical geneticists here in the U.S. as well as globally. So that's really what we're envisioning this to be. So. With that, just like to also acknowledge Diana Milowitz, as well as other collaborators at UT and the Texas Medical Center. And so that's really what we're hoping to do with this facial recognition component of Aortic GPT. And I guess I'll just end there.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Murdoch and Dr. Prakash, for your earlier presentation. We are running a little long here, but hopefully we can still answer a few questions if you all can stick around for a few extra minutes. I do acknowledge that it is the evening, so I won't keep you forever. And if the guys in your team wants to jump back in here, we have some questions for them as well. And if you do need to run, we understand. We are a little bit late here. So I had a number come in during the presentation, so thank you all. And obviously, the folks are really engaged with this. A good one to start with, I think, would be, let's see, talking about polygenic risk scores. Someone asked, are these already used in clinical care for other diseases? And if so, how does it work? Is it helping people prevent bad outcomes?
So I can try to answer that. So polygenic risk scores are being more and more used, but they're not all created equal. Some polygenic risk scores work better than others, and what they do is that they kind of predict a predisposition to specific diseases. But as of right now, I don't think they're diagnostic. So we don't really know how a polygenic risk score for a dissection or an aneurysm will work and how much influence it will have. But we think it could be a contributor, as I think Evan mentioned in his talk. It could be part of the risk factors that contribute to the overall picture.
Great. We also had two people ask about non-syndromic genetic heritable conditions. And essentially, one person was asking, are there any facial signs for things like ACTA2 or PRKG1 variants that cause aortic disease? And someone else asked, why do the syndromic ones cause difference in facial features and the other genes don't?
No, those are really excellent questions. So yes, I would say that this technique is probably going to work best for the syndromic condition. So Marfan, Loeys-Dietz, VEDS. That's not to say that it won't work on non-syndromic. And in reality, kind of the distinction between the two is somewhat blurred. But we've tried this with ACTA2, and it doesn't work quite as well as the other genes. But it could be because we need more images to train the models to detect some of those really subtle differences. Um, PRKG1, right now we're somewhat limited by the number of images that we have to train. So if any of you all are interested in submitting your images, you can reach out to us, and we can definitely look into that. But I suspect that probably it's going to be best for the syndromic conditions. But as to why some of these genes are associated with facial features, I mean, I think Marfan, Loeys-Dietz, VEDS, those conditions are also associated with other systemic features as well. So, Marfan, longer fingers, bony overgrowth. So likely, some of the same factors that are leading to those other features affect the face as well. And we're not exactly sure, why specifically. Some like VEDS individuals have similar features, but it's something that we know is the case, and it's something that we're trained to recognize. But as to exactly why that is, we don't know. But we're trying to leverage that feature for screening purposes.
Great. Lots of unanswered questions out there still, still to find out the answer to. Okay, this I believe was for the Geisinger team, and they asked, could this help decide which people in our family need preventative surgery? I had surgery at 52 after a type B dissection. My dad died in his 80s from something completely unrelated, and his sister dissected in her 40s. It seems like some people are spared and some aren't. You probably don't want to do surgery on people if they never need it.
Scott, you want to answer that one?
Yeah, sure. It's a great question, and that's certainly the hope, right? Because what we want to get to is personalized sort of risk assessment that goes beyond even just family history in a specific variant, because there may be other factors that could contribute to an individual's risk, including, how early in their life they might experience an aortic complication that we just don't have the information on. And I love what Siddharth and David presented, because I see a lot of potential for actually bringing these sorts of tools together, right? Because their focus on variant specific information, drawing from broad databases that no single institution can ever get to the bottom of those, but pulling that data into risk models that are population based, like ours, I think there could be a lot of power in that. And ultimately, being able to look at the variant, but also other clinical features and imaging features that might be specific for a given patient.
Very helpful. That's a really big question for folks out there who do have a known genetic cause identified in their family. This question is for Dr. Prakash, and it's about how can we actually, like, assuming this app works beautifully and great and is validated, how can we get this out to communities and hospitals, perhaps in rural areas where they aren't going to the academic conferences, there's less interaction. How do you foresee that working, or do you have any ideas about how we could basically get this in use everywhere?
Yeah, so we have designed two approaches. One will be, of course, to reach out to clinicians, but we understand that that is a limited process because we can't reach everyone where they are. The other way we're going to do it is to develop, as I mentioned, a patient-facing version of the app so that patients can look up their own variants and be able to interact with the app, and then take the reports to their clinicians. We think that this is a more effective way of introducing the app to a new audience. And in fact, in our follow-up to this, we're planning to do a clinical trial where we ask patients to do this, and then we follow them to see how it affects their care. Because we think that this could be a powerful signal to clinicians to get in tune with genetic information and raise awareness in the community.
Great. So I have one more for each group because we do acknowledge that we need to let you all go because we've run over here. This is a comment and a question, and something that has come up so often frequently for us. We're seeing more and more people who are incidentally identified as having an aneurysm after having a calcium score CT. This has gone from I never received questions about it to now I'm getting one every week or so. Even an own member of my family had this happen to them, so it hit home a little personal. So they wanted to ask or comment about the utility and frequency of folks being identified that way, who might never have come to an early diagnosis prior to an event. And then they also asked that, could you comment a little bit about aortic stiffness and how this affects your aortic health or disease? I would think stiffer is better, stronger.
Evan?
Fantastic questions. The honest answer is we don't know, and that's why we're undertaking this work to try to figure out what imaging factors may be protective and which may put us at risk. So, more to come, I guess, would be the short answer. But I think we have a long ways to go till we understand this complex pathology, and we're hopeful to shed some light on the question.
So I'm just going to add a little bit to this. In our work with aneurysm predictions, we have had some I don't want to say paradoxical kind of outcomes, things that, like, for instance, one of the things that we found is like having type 2 diabetes actually reduces the risk of some types of aneurysms that I think anecdotally some people knew, but we find it in our predictive models. Again, like Evan said, we're going to put these aortic calcium scores, which I'm not sure whether they're reflected in the coronary calcium scores all the time, but we're going to incorporate that into our predictive models, and to see whether it shifts it to the right or to the left or it's neutral. But I guess this will all come out in the data.
And I'm happy to touch on the stiffness issue. It is paradoxical, and at least conceptually, and I'm not a biomechanical engineer, but the aorta is meant to be elastic. It's a key property of the aortic wall. It's meant to expand under the force of blood coming out of the heart, and then recoil to keep the blood moving, but also to maintain its normal sort of properties. The stiffer it becomes, the less able it is to do that. And while that seems like it would prevent rupture, think about a rubber band. And you all have rubber bands in your drawer that have been sitting there for far too long, and they have lost their elasticity. And what you notice is when you try to wrap that rubber band around something, it breaks very quickly. And so I think that's a good analogy for what happens to the aortic wall. Yes, it's got a property called more stiffness, but it actually becomes more fragile and less able to do its job.
That is a very helpful analogy because I think intuitively, if we think about it as a pipe, then of course we want it to be as stiff and hard as possible. But that analogy really helped there. Okay, so last question then for the UT folks. And it basically wants you both to address the issue of variants of uncertain significance, which, many people are navigating life with one of those VUSs, which I think is a difficult place to kind of live in. And as Meredith mentioned at the start, when you aren't sure if something is causing disease or not and having to kind of live in that uncertainty, how would each of your projects address these, or can they help address that problem?
David, do you want to take this first?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think this could be, whenever we're kind of interpreting a variant, they're different. There's different information that goes into that, like how often is that variant seen in the population, certain predictions, what kind of variant it is, and all these kind of go together to determine what that final classification is, whether it's benign, uncertain, pathogenic. Um, in we envision that potentially, this could be another component of what goes into that classification. What is their score, their facial score? Is it 95% likely that this person, based on facial image analysis, has VEDS, for example? That could become a component of another bit of information to add to making that final classification. So yes, I mean, I think that this could potentially add to to the ability to either upgrade or downgrade a variant, but we still have a lot more work to do to show that it's accurate and but I do potentially think that it could help with VUS resolution. Yeah.
And the corollary of that is we need everyone to participate in more research. The more participants we have, the more data we have to resolve these variants of uncertain significance, because it's essentially an idea that we don't have enough information currently to make the call. As we get more and more sequence information and clinical information from groups like Geisinger with the large data sets and groups like MAC, then we will be able to resolve these variants. So the other message I have for everyone who's living with a VUS is to check back frequently with your genetics team, because those do get reclassified. And we hope that Aorta GPT and other apps will help us to recall these variants and understand how they change over time when we look at the data going forward.
Fantastic. Well, with that, I will let you all go here. Thank you so much for your time this evening. We know how valuable it is. We're so excited to have you as part of the John Ritter Foundation family now, and to be supporting your research. As Meredith mentioned at the start, this was a very competitive year, and we had a really hard time deciding. There was so many great proposals, but we're really excited about the outcomes. And I don't know if y'all are looking in the chat here, but many other people are excited and thanking you all for your work and your interest in working on this condition, and just very impressed with the projects you presented. So thank you very much for being a part of this work.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank
All right.
you.
Have a good evening, everyone.
Right.